Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. It is Monday, November 10th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. Before we begin today, I just want to mention what we're offering at Times of Israel, a series of Israeli documentary films you can watch from home with English subtitles. You have the opportunity to ask questions directly to the filmmakers in exclusive Q&A webinars that we host. It's called DocuNation, and it's available to members of our reader support group, the Times of Israel community. For more info, just go to timesofisrael.com/films. That's timesofisrael.com/films. On to today's podcast. I'm speaking today with Lazar, diplomatic correspondent Lazar Berman, and our diplomatic reporter Nava Freiberg. Hi, Lazar.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. Hi, Nava.
Good morning, Jessica.
Good morning. It is day 766 of the war. Last night, after more than 11 years in captivity, the body of fallen soldier Hadar Goldin was brought home to Israel. He will be buried tomorrow on Tuesday at the military cemetery in Kfar Saba. There are still 4 remaining slain hostages whose bodies are held in Gaza. Today is the burial for Lior Rudaif, the 61-year-old deputy security coordinator for Kibbutz Nir Yitzchak. He was killed while battling Islamic Jihad terrorists in his community on October 7th. His body abducted to Gaza, now brought back, and he is being buried actually as we speak. We will talk about the long-awaited release of Goldin's body, of the body of Hadar Goldin, the visit and meetings that are happening right now with Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, the prospects of conflicts, of another round of conflict with Iran and Lebanon, and all of that and some more, so stay with us. Lazar, let's start with Hadar Goldin, which felt really as it was unrolling yesterday, and Nava and I will talk more about it because she wrote a very extensive piece about as we were readying ourselves for it yesterday afternoon. Let's talk about the diplomatic aspects of the return of Hadar Goldin's body, which his family, his parents, his twin, his older brother and sister have all been struggling for 11 years and 3 months on many different fronts to bring home their son. What's some of the sort of the diplomatic fallout or conversation that you've been handling over the last day and obviously the last weeks as these last bodies were being brought back?
Yeah, so I think it's important to start with the fact that Hamas is in violation of the ceasefire. According to Trump's 20-point plan, and people can go read this online, in the first 72 hours of the ceasefire, so from October 10th to October 13th, Hamas was supposed to release all 20 living hostages and then all 28 slain hostages. They released all 20 living hostages, and they released none of the slain hostages in that 72-hour window. Only after all the slain hostages were returned was Israel required to release, over 1,000 terrorists, 250 hardened terrorists. And other prisoners as well. Israel released them only after the living ones, but before they got a single slain hostage back. And since then, there's been this diplomatic push and pull. Israel says Hamas is playing games with the pace of the bodies, but every so often there's a release of 1 or 2 bodies. Israel maintains that Hamas could have done this much quicker, and that seems to be true because clearly Hamas knew exactly where Hadar Goldin's body was. And was able to get there itself from Israel-controlled territory when Israel couldn't find it. But the drama now is around this group of 100 to 200 Hamas terrorists that are holed up in tunnels in Rafah, in Israel-controlled territory, and what is going to happen to them. Now, there's been reports that I myself have not been able to verify, but we've seen this in different places, that the U.S. is pushing, along with Turkey, for this deal that would allow these terrorists to either go into exile or to give up their arms and go back into Hamas-controlled part of Gaza. And Hadar Goldin's body was part of this process. Give up Hadar Goldin's body, and then they would get to live or go free. Of course, Israel has already paid the price for Hadar Goldin's body in that they paid what they needed to do. They stopped the war. They retreated. They let humanitarian aid in for all of the hostages. So Israel's already paid the price for Hadar Goldin's body. To pay a price again, and to pay it for over 100 active terrorists, we know how dangerous one terrorist could be. And 100 is a significant number. In Israel, the IDF has invested a lot of blood and treasure in terms of killing Hamas terrorists. So when you have 100 who are trapped and you're going to release them, it's a very big concession. And these terrorists haven't just been sitting there. There's been those two incidents over the past 3 weeks in which 3 IDF soldiers have been killed in Rafah. That's this group of terrorists. So that's the drama right now. Now, this gets even more pressing because Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are in Israel. They're meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu as we speak. They're obviously talking about the state of the Gaza ceasefire and what is happening. And of course, this fate of these couple hundred terrorists is going to be on the agenda as well. So we'll probably know more as the day goes on. I will just say publicly, you have ministers in the government who are saying under no circumstances will these terrorists get to go back. It's either they give up or they get killed. But we will see. We know how much impact pressure from the Trump administration has on Israeli decision making. And let's see what happens in this case as well.
Okay, got that. Now, moving just on to both Iran and Lebanon, we have these headlines from a New York Times piece that we reported on that it seems that there could be another round of the Iran-Israel war, that it could very possibly be in the offing. What are you looking at right now as you examine that?
Yeah, so I think it's important to remember that even though a war or a military operation might go very well, especially on the tactical side, but even above that. So this operation in June against Iran and its military and its nuclear program and its ballistic missiles went very well for Israel. And we got hit with some missiles back, but it was not a very comparative. It was comparatively a pretty moderate price that we paid. But that doesn't mean that this issue was solved. And Israel never said that it was solved. You've had very kind of optimistic statements from Trump, but Trump is Trump, so he says what he says. But it was certainly effective, but that doesn't mean the issue was solved. And now it seems, given the fact that there's no IAEA investigation in new sites, and it seems to be that Iran has learned lessons, that they've opened up a new site, that they understand that their old sites that were hit are damaged beyond use for the time being, maybe permanently. So they are reinvesting and opening up new sites. There's also fear that they understand that their response was not adequate. It didn't punish Israel enough. There wasn't enough of a deterrent. So they are trying to get into a position where they can fire thousands of rockets at Israel instead of just several hundred over the course, but several thousand, maybe even in very intense barrages. So that is where things stand now. Of course, there's a question of whether the U.S. Will get involved again, and how much sanctions pressure could be put on Iran. But what you hear from Iran now is very tough talk, promises that they're not going to enter into negotiations with the U.S. unless sanctions are lifted and other things that aren't going to, and the U.S. will pay compensation for the war. Those things obviously aren't going to happen. So there is absolutely plenty of scenarios in which we find ourselves in active combat with Iran once again in the coming year.
Right. And then, which leads us to Lebanon and Hezbollah. And there also seems to be a somewhat of a ramping up. And you have spoken about this in our Friday Focus podcast and also been writing about it, obviously, because we keep on having these incidents. How are you looking at the situation in the north?
Yeah, so this once again follows that same principle. So the Hezbollah war was the most successful of the fronts that we've had since October 7th, 2023. Unimaginably successful. And the fact that Hezbollah agreed in November 2024 to this humiliating ceasefire in which basically Israel gets to strike where it wants, Hezbollah doesn't respond. And the Lebanese army has begun this process of disarming Hezbollah. But that's where the problem stands, in that the pace of disarmament is less than Hezbollah's rearmament. And it seems like Israel's very energetic operations against Hezbollah are also not enough to prevent it from rearming. So that things are starting to come to a head. You hear increasingly strident warnings from Israel, the same from the U.S., from Tom Barak, who is the U.S. representative to the ambassador to Turkey, but he deals with Syria and Lebanon as well. So you're really starting to see that things are ramping up. And all sorts of warnings from anonymous officials, from Barak himself, again, about the potential Israeli operation. For now, I think it is a pressure campaign to press the Lebanese government to actually carry out this disarmament more quickly, more aggressively. And right now, it's only south of the Litani. You have the rest of Lebanon, where Hezbollah certainly has significant caches, including long-range weapons, especially in the Bekaa Valley. We need to see that the Lebanese army is going to act there. But if this continues, I think it's even more likely that we see an Israeli operation there, not necessarily a ground operation, perhaps an air operation, but that is absolutely a possibility as well.
Thanks for that, Lazar. We're going to take a quick break. When we're back, Nava's going to talk to us about details behind the Hadar Goldin release and moreover, really, why did it take so long? Why did it take 11 years and 3 months? What were some of the issues that were going on throughout that entire period? So stay with us. Okay. So Nava, you wrote a very comprehensive piece in the Hours, as really it felt like, everyone was waiting with bated breath to see if this was actually going to be Hadar Goldin's body that was released back to Israel. This was yesterday. And part of your piece deals with the fact that there were, of course, hostages in Gaza before October 7th, 4 of them, 2 living and 2 who were no longer alive. So talk to us about what you found as you sort of delved into this, why it went under the radar for so long, why it was allowed to go under the radars for so long.
Sure. So the main reason that I think this piece was important is that we've seen a lot of hostages come out who spent, 500 days, 700 days in Hamas captivity. But what we saw with the return of Hadar Goldin was actually the end of the longest hostage case that Israel has dealt with since it withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2007. Hadar Goldin's body was held for 4,118 days. So you can think of all the stickers that people wear, of the numbers of days in solidarity with the hostages that were there. So a lot of those were living, of course, which is an important distinction to make, that living in captivity versus, being a slain hostage. There's a significant difference there, but nonetheless, it really was a long episode that has hopefully now, come to full closure. And there's a lot that's important to remember in terms of understanding how drastically Israel's approach to the hostage issue changed after October 7th. That's, of course, because the circumstances changed. We went from 4 to, over 250 hostages.
This wasn't the first time that there have been talks with Hamas in the 11 years, right? There were other times that the Goldins were engaged through diplomatic efforts, through the Israeli government, through other governments, to get their son's body released. Tell us about some of the things that you found out about that process. You write in your story that there was basically like this chunk of 9 years and then the last 2 years. But what were some of the things that you noted over those 9 years that clearly did not work, but that seemed to bring the case closer to a close, but ultimately it did not happen?
Right. So the efforts on the part of Israel to free these 4 hostages looked very different than what we've seen over the course of the war. That's part of what shifted in the last 2 years of, these efforts to free Goldin and the 3 others, was that they got sort of included in the broader negotiations to release the larger group of hostages from Gaza. But negotiations were going on for nearly a decade before October 7th. I spoke to Doron Hadar, who was the head of the IDF General Staff Team for negotiations. And so he, from the day that Hadar Goldin was murdered and abducted, as well as Aron Shaul, who was the second IDF soldier, and Avera Mengistu and Yisham al-Sayed, the 2 living hostages. One was a Ethiopian-born Israeli citizen. The other was a Bedouin Arab Israeli citizen from southern Israel who were alive during their captivity. So these 4 cases, he was involved in negotiations to free them. And what he said was that the 2 IDF soldiers were essentially, Hamas would only agree to release them in exchange for freeing a large number of terrorists serving life sentences. We're talking serious, hardened terrorists that Israel was not willing to give up, because in these negotiations, they were talking about 2 slain hostages and 2 civilians who were also suffering mental illness and came from more minority communities in Israel. And the overall episode didn't gain the public attention or outrage that we've seen since October 7th. But that wasn't for lack of effort on the part of the Goldins. And you can, I'm sure, attest to this yourself because you've spoken with them at length, that they, were relentless in trying to push the government to focus on these four hostages. They advocated for their son's release, but also for the other three. And what's interesting is that they had actually a pretty hardline stance on what they wanted, how they wanted the government to handle this. They called for to cut off any humanitarian assistance to Gaza, to take a more aggressive approach against Hamas. They spoke out against this deterrence policy that we saw from Israel against Hamas rulership in Gaza in the years leading up to October 7th. And so it's one of the earlier cases that you can see people actually flagging this as a problem and saying, take this opportunity of hostages being held by this terror group in control of Gaza to really try and solve this in a permanent way. And a lot of the criticism that I heard when I was speaking to people or just doing the research for this piece was that, in a way, we almost paid a heavier price on October 7th for these four hostages and the rest because of the failure to more effectively fight Hamas earlier on.
Yeah, I hear you on that. In fact, Leah and Simcha Goldin, Hadar's parents, who gave a statement last night, elated to receive their son's body. In their statements, they said two things very clearly. They very specifically thanked the IDF, and they said it was only because of the IDF that their son's body was brought home. And they both spoke a lot about the idea of the Israeli values of that you send someone out to be a combat soldier and you bring that person back. And that is something that they always considered to be the value that in which they sent their sons to be combat fighters, to be combat soldiers in the army. And that, of course, they had to fight 11 years to get that son's body home. I wanted to ask you about the prisoner exchange piece of it, which plays into what you were just saying, which, of course, they were not, as you've been mentioning, the various details of what they were pushing for. As I always understood it, they were also not pushing for a prisoner exchange in order to get Hadar's body back.
Right. And that's another interesting aspect here. I didn't look in depth into what the families of Mengistu or Saad or Shaul's what their approach was in terms of the exchange, but you definitely saw more, again, a tougher approach from the Goldins in the sense of you should lay out threats and punishments to Hamas rather than concessions. And I think it's important here to also focus on Hamas's side of the negotiations because it shows, I think this is also an earlier case of the hostage doctrine that they developed over time. And this case of Goldin and the three others, it took place across multiple Israeli governments, Netanyahu, Yair Lapid, Naftali Bennett, and they all spoke about the importance of getting the hostages back, but we didn't really see results in the end. And it's important to emphasize that on the Hamas side, things stayed the same. This is what I heard from Doron Hadar, again, that former negotiator who was really taking part in these talks, that the main people he was speaking to were Yahya Sinwar and Rahi Mushtaha, who was the de facto prime minister of the Gaza Strip, a very senior Hamas leader and Sinwar's right-hand man. Both of these leaders were killed by the IDF over the war, but they themselves were freed in the Gilad Shalit deal, which freed 1,027 terrorists from Israeli prison in exchange for one living IDF soldier, Gilad Shalit. And so all of this really ties together in a pretty crazy way when you think about it, because these two Hamas leaders who were freed themselves in a prisoner exchange deal knew how much Hamas can gain by holding out and being stubborn in these hostage exchanges. And in the end, this was another thing that Doron emphasized when I spoke to him, that Hamas, a large part, really, really a crucial part of October 7th, according to him, and others make this claim too, was Hamas wanting to get their terrorists freed from Israeli jail cells. And what's important to add as well is, so much so, even during these talks, they wouldn't release information on the bodies of Shaul or Goldin without the exchange of terrorists. So just to get confirmation about the status, because Israel declared them that they had fallen in battle based on forensic evidence, but the families didn't receive official confirmation from Hamas, and Hamas tried a lot of psychological warfare. They even penned a letter that they claimed was written by Shaul to try and play games about, whether or not they're alive. And just to get information on these two soldiers, Hamas said, no, you have to free terrorists. So the motivation there is very strong, and, they held out. And you can see Sinwar, the architect of October 7th, really took this hostage doctrine to the max. And in the end, it's important to say that as incredible as it is to see these families finally get a sense of closure, and not just these 4 previous hostages, but all the hostages on October 7th that now, they're laid to rest or return to their families. We're able to close that chapter, but at the same time, the price we ended up paying was the release of hardened, dangerous terrorists. And there's still more that Hamas is trying to get out. And there's a lot of important thought and lessons, I think, to learn here.
Yeah. And the questions of, right, what's the right thing to do in these situations? And definitely many thoughts, certainly among the hostages' families and among the rest of Israeli society. We'll obviously link to Nava's article in the podcast piece, the podcast notes. So please make sure to take a look at it. Nava, thank you. Thank you for being on the Daily Briefing. I don't know if Lazar is over there next to you.
He's somewhere over there.
He's somewhere. All right. Somewhere in the Times Visual offices. It's been good to have you. Thank you for listening to the Times Visual's Daily Briefing, and stay tuned for tomorrow's installment. Always feel free to recommend us to other listeners and rate us wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, take care and be well.